Welcome back to Producer's Toolbox. I'm your host, Carol Adrian, and today we have a fascinating episode about making horror films. You're going to meet two brilliant young filmmakers from Stanford University who have made a horror film short that has had more than 10 million views online. So let's take a quick 1-minute look at Second Nature, a college horror movie.
Did you touch it?
Touch what?
The painting. It's too late. You gotta cut it off.
Cut what off?
You gotta cut it off.
So that was tense. Well, let us meet the filmmakers. Song Si-poo from Stanford University is the writer, producer, director, and M. Cyprien Fasquelle, also from Stanford, is the director of photography. Hey guys, thank you so much for leading us down the path of horror. So let's find, why do we love horror? What do you think?
Well, horror is a. I think when we speak of horror, we think about gore. We think about scary things. I think that's sort of the typical reaction, and I think that's true. I think overall across all the horror movies, that's kind of the theme that people remember the most. However, to us, while we were making our movie, I think the theme was, when we think of horror, we were thinking about creating a mythical lore that could feel real, that feel like it could exist in parallel to what we're experiencing. And I think that's what we think a little bit of what horror is or feels like.
Well, you must be thinking like pretty clearly because 10 million views, guys. Cyprian, what's your opinion? Why do we love it?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us here, Carol.
Oh, my pleasure.
I think from my point of view, it's kind of like there's a car crash, right? You can't look away. And you kind of, I guess, in our instance, this film was very much inspired by the location. And I think for us, when we were walking through this location, our mind started to ruminate and imagine darker futures or possibilities, so to speak, right? And kind of letting ourselves go down that path, and imagining what that would be like, and actually letting ourselves just like sit in it, as opposed to just like, oh, let's not think about that. I think that's a lot of where horror comes from, and what is really fascinating about the genre. You can kind of explore these dark imaginations from the safety of your couch, right?
Safety being a key there. You're right. The other thing I've always wondered, having done some serious research on fear, I wondered if like one of the reasons that we like horror movies is that adrenaline rush. It's just, it is actually a physical response to something visual or auditory. But do you think that could be it at all? That the actual fight or flight response is kicking in and giving us juice of that level? That would be. Wow. Now, what do you think defines horror? Like, does it have to be severed heads, dismembered bodies, blood? Is it psychological? What's horrifying in horror?
Well, I think my first thought is that actually I kind of want to reflect on what was just mentioned. In terms of what horror is. I mean, in terms of the place, right? Cyprian mentioned that this movie does. I mean, it was shot in the hallways on a painting, and well, the painting actually exists. And I think going back to what defines horror, I like to say that it's that feeling of when you see something and you get a little goosebump, right? You're like, oh, ooh, wow, okay, what was that? That's a little odd. And actually, that's exactly what happened when I think I first entered that hallway. I saw a very strange painting that actually does exist in that hallway, and I got a little thought. I was like, oh, wow, okay, that was odd. I think that that's what kicked it off, and I think that in the movie, that's what we're trying to replicate is that feeling of oh, that's odd. Yeah.
So the place really spoke to you like this could be a setting for a horror film. Were you not out to do horror film to begin with?
Real quick, I'll just say, yeah, the place very much inspired it for us. What was interesting was prior to the film, and maybe part of the inspiration, the dorm was very empty. When you watch the film, you'll notice these long, like clinical hallways with white lights, very standardized doors, and most of it is nothing on the walls. Carpeted floors, super quiet, no one's going about. And it's sort of like that all day. Nobody's going about. You know, there's, you know, a few hundred to 1,000 students somewhere in this building. Yet, how is it possible that you barely run into anyone? Right? Doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so, this is where Songchi and I were first like, okay, there's something here that's eerie. It's kind of weird, but you sort of get used to it. And then, as he was saying, when the they must have gotten feedback from the students saying this place is, clinical. It's bare, and they started putting paintings up over the summer. And that's exactly that moment. So she's like, okay, well, something's changed, right? All of a sudden, I'm walking past. There's this painting that's sort of drawing my attention, and there's something weird about it because all of a sudden, we didn't see who put it up. It just showed up, right?
Yeah.
And so that specifically to our type of horror curiosity, kind of like that little back of the neck tingling, oh, something feels a little off here. That sense of fear that we wanted to build into really came from kind of that dynamic and that change.
So I like to clarify that this movie, like in terms of like how many views that this movie has, the millions of views, as I mentioned in the email, did come from the viral TikToks that were spread out, right? So it's like I think basically I think I briefly mentioned on how the like the movie recap channels took the movie and chopped it up into like short pieces, right? And the story pretty much. Sorry?
I didn't realize that. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then they posted it. So it's our visuals and our stories, and then these clips over across all these channels, as we found out, got viral on TikTok, and that's where the millions of views came from. Well, it's still the movies, so well, that's why when I mention it, well, I usually say it has 10 million views on the internet, right? Because that is true, right? It's our story, it's our visuals, but it's not through our direct distribution. So
Okay.
I just like to make that clarification.
Let's see. Now, were you already thinking about making a horror film? I know you've been thinking filmically for a long time because actually you were on this show several years ago when you were in high school and you made really a wonderful short called The Model Minority. And so I kept tabs and I thought, oh, now he's into horror. But did it start with horror or did it start with the location?
Well, it's good to be back for sure. And I guess for that, I like to share a little bit on where like how this movie came to be, right? I mean, this is actually not the first horror movie that I made. So actually, the story was that at Stanford, I've lived in this dorm before, and before any horror movie, and that's when I realized, wait, this place is a little too eerie to not make a horror movie in here. So I want to say maybe a year and a half ago, in 2023, I had this idea. Sure, okay, why don't we just make a short horror movie? And at that point, it was just, I had a little idea. At that point, there was no painting in the hallway yet, right? It was just a hallway. And the thing about this dorm is that you could actually, it's like this dorm has it's you can think of it as a high rise, right? It's a high rise kind of apartment style building, and the things that you could see from one side to another, you could see into the window, right? So I guess that's what creeped me out a little bit. In the sense that you could really see across to the other side of the building. So that's what inspired the first movie. So that's where the first concept came around, and the first one was called Doppelganger. It was really scrappy. It was a really scrappy student film made by me and a friend who Denise, who does taps, who's a really good performer. And the camera, right? So we just made it a couple minutes long. Didn't really know what to expect. And after we released it out to campus, actually a lot of people watched and enjoyed it. And she tells me a lot that she gets recognized in the dining halls. Yeah, so I think that's what gave this the first sort of I guess inspiration to doing something a little bit on a larger scale. Yes, so over the past summer, when summer came around, I was around campus, and I had this idea. I saw the painting. I had the idea, and I was like, okay, I gotta hit up Cyprian and see if he's around. And he's around. He was around. So
You knew it was meant to be. Well, I'm glad because in this episode, we're going to talk about how you guys planned it. And we're going to have a second episode about the actual production issues. But in terms of the planning, how did that work with the story? Did you storyboard? Was it a combined effort? Can you give us a little of like how did it flesh out into actual shooting?
yeah, man, I could go ahead and
Sure.
Cyprian could, yeah, it could offer his perspective as well. So basically, how the story started was that okay, maybe the first day of the movie, and second day, first week, I saw the painting in the hallway, and I was like, oh wow, okay, that's a little odd. And I also knew that I was going to be at the dorm, around the dorm during the summer. And I was like, okay, I already made a horror movie here. What about? I mean, I have some time here. Why not make another one, right? So and then kind of the stories came around, and then like themes kind of started appearing, right? And then I called up Cyprian, and we actually met and had lunch, and we were just chatting and throwing out, kind of bouncing off of ideas. And yeah, and then we just kind of brainstormed from there, and took some more information, went back, developed some more stories, and actually went to LA. It was 4th of July, and yeah, and then we chatted some more. Yeah.
Cyprian, had you dabbled in horror before, or was this your first foray?
I've definitely worked in thriller short films before and like worked on building that suspense. And so I sort of knew the tools, but I had never looked to build a world that kind of merged into that horror surreal type of space. Um, so that part was new, and I think at first when Song Tu came to me, I was like, horror films. Like my initial thought was, okay, maybe
He's like,
like
"What's wrong with me?"
why I'm not sure why I would work on this because I was always so driven by like really deep stories, things that I felt like everyone could relate to and went beyond like a surface level. But then when he came to me more with the story, I was like, okay, it actually can go way deeper than what people initially write off horror to be, right? And so we started having this back and forth about the story. And I kept asking more and more questions. And that kind of inquisitive mindset really allowed the two of us to go deep on how this would work. And so Songsi had this vision, and I just basically kept, I guess, tempering at it so until it was like super, super strong. And and then at one point, I was sold on his vision, right?
Did you storyboard it, or did you just pace it out?
um, yeah, I mean, so kind of what happened was that I think the way that I think of stories, or at least some of those horror moments, or Okay, in the beginning, there were probably some themes. There was probably some scenes in my head that feels very strong, right? And then, okay, I in my head I was like, okay, that's probably very interesting. That's exactly how I shared with Cyprian, right? Like I didn't give him like a very full story in the very beginning. But what I what initially I depicted was okay. Think of this scene right here. I think of that scene right there, right? And then I actually remember this very clearly that he said, okay, you know what? Well, maybe we could just start storyboarding some of those scenes and like develop them a little bit more, and we'll start seeing some sort of connection and those scenes will slowly compose into a story. So, and I think that's what happened. Yeah.
Wow. Did you guys discuss if there was going to be carnage or whether it was going to be more psychological or
I well, I think from my point of view, it was gonna be. I think from a production level, I guess it really developed, right? I think in the very beginning, the story wasn't gonna be like that scary. Like there wasn't gonna be some like really drastic sequence in there. But I think like as the story developed, some of the pieces fitted in naturally. Yeah.
I thought you guys handled it subtly and beautifully. I was afraid because I'm squeamish. And so I was kind of like, okay, should I watch? But I thought what you did was really like, ooh, that came out of nowhere. And so I won't spoil it for anybody, but there is blood, but it's not, a wild, violent scene or anything. But it's more the idea that there could be,
Mhm.
more blood. But yeah, it was so had you both watched a lot of psychological thrillers? Because I thought that's a very strong element in yours.
I personally have, and I've been living in LA for the last 11 years, or that's what my license says, anyways. Um, but in that time, in learning the craft of film and storytelling and making a lot of short films and videos, I've also spent a lot of time on the other side of the camera, right? And I ended up meeting all of these auditions and things like that, other creatives, other actors, other filmmakers, and so I would also engage in their work. And so I'd say I spent a lot more time watching a lot of short films because very early on, that's a lot of what is done. And so there's like so many lessons in creating tension and horror. And I have one friend who only does basically horror films. That's like his favorite genre. And I will catch him going to any small, medium, large horror festival in LA. And he has, you know, a one room flat, but it's just filled with paraphernalia from whatever you can imagine. Um,
Body
and
parts.
I learned from his films very much like, and a lot of it bordered on horror comedy, right? And so I was like, okay, when this, when I wanted to create the imagery, I wanted to make sure we strayed away from like going too over the top and really using the psychological components to drive the story forward. And I was fully ready to do like a big bloody scene, but I think Sungsi, I don't think that was your style necessarily. Um, and so I'm very happy that we were able to leverage more like the seen and unseen. That
I was impressed by the brevity of it because short form is not my particular expertise. So I'm always impressed when somebody can compress a complex story into a small time frame. And you did. I mean, that's 13 minutes long, but it really, boy, it goes a lot of places. And it winds up, I mean, it's a satisfying completion to it. Did you have a time frame in mind when you started? Did you know it was going to be a short?
Yeah. I think it was. I mean, from the story's perspective, we know in the beginning I was gonna be a short movie. I mean, it could potentially. I mean, let's take a step back, right? The way that kind of think about this. I mean, especially given the location of it, right? We like just imagine a video game that has several locations that you could enter, right, and exit. And that's essentially what this film did in the end, right? You enter some location. There's some locations that appeared and reappeared, right? And then you kind of enter kind of each locations by levels, or you revisit them later on in the movie. And then it's also very limited, right? Because you're not shown a lot of these locations. That's why maybe it feels like you're entering this world that's composed of these couple of locations that we created. So I think that that's something that's really interesting to think about. Um, yeah.
Okay, here's a boring hardware kind of question, but an important one. Did you guys deal? Now you had, and Song Si is one of the actors, and actually we'll talk about this next time because I feel that Cyprian's camera is almost one of the actors. We'll talk about that in the production aspects. But did you did you get releases for the actors? Did you get a location release for the dorm? Did you have to deal with all that yucky paperwork?
Well, I think the note on that is that this film actually it feels pretty spontaneous. I think that that's the word to describe it. And I think it really originated as a couple phone calls and hey, just kind of, with friends around us saying, hey, you want to work on something cool? And I guess because of that, the whole process, I mean, although we spent a lot of time into it, it still feels like a pretty spontaneous project. And so the short answer is that it feels spontaneous and it's not, we haven't really gotten into a lot of these paperworks, but I think, if we were to do more of them, that's something that we should look into next time. That's something we learn.
Definitely.
I will say, living in LA, I've had certain cases where I've had to apply for film permits and things like that. But the general rule is, if it's a public place that has permits, you do need kind of these permits if you're using anything tripod or heavier, really. Um, and but on private property, really it's the rule of whoever owns the space. And at Stanford, I was a president of a film production club for 2 years prior to this film. And basically the lay of the land there was just if the logo isn't shown and the locations are not clearly that any reasonable person off the street would identify with the institution, then you're pretty much good to go. Right.
So it's okay, unless you can say, "Oh, that's the coffee shop at Eighth and
Yeah.
Vine."
Yeah.
You,
Yeah. I mean, in that case, I'm pretty sure they have people they would want to look at it. Especially if there's no like credit given and it's not really about the brand itself, but that's just the art of filmmaking, you know. In other countries, it's a little more lax, I will say. I will say.
I've heard that, although I have not produced anything elsewhere. But well, I'm curious. Can I ask each of you if there's one thing that stands out to you that you learned from this particular film?
Well, there's so many things that we've learned throughout the process, and me especially. But I think the one thing that really stood out is just how fun this whole experience is. I mean, I feel like I've been hearing this. I made some films before, and I feel like from whoever film teacher or people who's done this for a while, they always talk about how fun this experience is, right? Coming up, right? Being together with friends and just this whole production feels like a show, right? In the sense that everyone's being creative, right? Everyone's like, to me, it feels like you just put a bunch of kids who love Lego in a Lego land for a whole weekend and see what could come out of it. I think that that is what at least for me, what I learned really was that, oh wow, like this whole thing is so fun, and I think that everyone's just trying to, like everyone, right? Like the cinematographer is trying to do something, trying creative things. The acting, right? The actors are trying something creative. The PAs are trying something creative. Production designers are trying something creative. Artists are trying something great creative. So the whole thing just feels very creative. Yeah, and I think that that's, I think that if there were to be any projects that I aim to, work or craft in the future, that's the feeling that I'd love to replicate.
I was so surprised that the first time I was involved in anything, I hadn't expected to love teamwork. And when it turned out like you're really just one link in that chain that makes it happen, and that was monumental to me, and I've come to love that part. Cyprian, what called to you?
I think that was definitely a huge part. I think there are not too many film sets I've worked on where there isn't like a conflict or a tension. And this is one of them where we didn't really fight at all. And I've never had to like have a sit down and say like, can we talk separately? Right? We've never really had that moment here. And so I really appreciated kind of just working, and Songsi really gave me space to be creative. I'd be like, I want to try this thing. Can we try it like this? Or these are the two or three options I'm thinking. What do you think? Do you like this framing? Do you like this lighting? How do you want to show this character? And I think there was what was cool was we were not a huge crew, so there was not a lot of stepping on each other's toes at all. And there wasn't really a battle of egos. And it was just we really were dedicated to the teamwork, and that just made it work super well. And so overall, it was just a fantastic experience. And usually if you work 12, 14-hour days, you can get quite groggy after. But we did that back to back here and barely felt it.
When it's good like that and the
Yeah.
team works well and the creative ideas are bouncing off one another, it's the closest thing I can think of to feeling like you're flying. It just unleashes all those energies, and it's magical.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's, yeah, pretty
Can
close
I?
way to describe it.
I'm
Sorry.
sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, you're in there too? The flying.
Yeah, yeah, no. Yeah.
Well, what about Songsi? Do you have, I want to ask each of you for a piece of advice that you have for our aspiring horror filmmakers out there. What would you, and we're talking in terms of the planning with this episode. What's your offering to those guys?
Well, just do it. I mean, it sounds so very it sounds like a very cheesy advice that everyone says. That I definitely, before doing a bunch of these projects, didn't really believe that. Right? I was like, okay, everyone says that. Nike says that for sure, right? But I think that there is something to it in terms of, when you have inspiration, just act on it, and that will get you pretty far sometime. Yeah.
I think that's like Hemingway saying, write one true sentence, and you're on the truth plane. Cyprian, how about you? What do you recommend for?
Uh, well, there is a common saying that's given to a lot of writers, which is just write what you know, right? And I think in this instance, I would say the same. Start with the things that make you scared. If you want to go into horror, right? What are the things that scare you? What are those things that tingle the back of your neck? And you could do it for somebody else, but especially when you're learning how to speak through the craft of cinema, I think it helps if you have a very, very clear idea of the feeling or moment you want to capture or express. And so you can then learn to translate that into film, right? So just start with the things that scare you and go from there. And they could be little, right? It could be just I'm walking through the house at night and I turned off the lights downstairs and I have to run upstairs because otherwise something's gonna grab me. But yeah.
Beautifully expressed. Oh, thank you guys so much. And to our audience, please tune back in next time because Sangsi and Cyprian are going to talk about the actual production and offer their thoughts and advice on it. And in the meantime, start thinking about what scares you. And please join us again on Producer's Toolbox. Thank you.